And we are live. This is the On Blast Podcast NFL Picks Edition. My name is Sheldon Alexander. The voice sounds a little raspy, a little rough. That's just the times that we're in right now, the month of January, but also the times where we power through because it's the playoffs, right? Does that make sense? I think that makes sense. Anyways, I'm joined, as always, by my guy, Mr. Matt Russell, who is feeling a lot better than I am, which is good, so that you can carry the load on this pod because my voice, I got coffee, I got some Halls, I got some water. I got a lot of things to try to get me through, and I got a mute button to also try to get me through this pod. But we will make it because it is a divisional round. But first, my friend, how are you? How did Super Wildcard Weekend treat you?
I mean, let's be honest here, right? Like, it's not an illness; it's raspiness from yelling "Godwin" 450 times on Monday night.
Oof.
As every one of what Tom Brady's 66, 67 pass dropbacks had a little tinge of hope. Now, again, a lot of those were from his own 20-yard line, 15-yard line on 3rd and long after running Leonard Fournette or Rachaad White into the line on 1st and or 2nd down. That being said, yeah, I can understand how you'd have a raspy voice there with screaming Godwin at the top of your lungs, especially late into Monday night. But other than that, other than our reference to the anytime touchdown parlay that obviously had an outstanding go of it for its first 4, didn't quite get to the 5th one. That would have just had us diving into gold doubloons like a young Scrooge McDuck. I'm great, man. Like, started off, if you told me we were going to win that much money in the divisional round or the wild card round, I would have said I'm not really sure how we get there, but I'm into it. And now we're just kind of playing with house money for the rest of the postseason here, which honestly it's always so weird, right? You play one weekend of postseason football, and then you realize that the playoffs are half over. 6 games down, 7 games to go, and yeah, it's kind of sad, but we'll save those tears for a later day.
Why'd you have to put it that way, man? Like, the vibes are all the way up here, and then all of a sudden, like, you got to change the vibes and make me feel sad, man.
Listen, less
we only get
opportunity
to do this
for
a
us
couple times.
Less opportunity for us to screw this up. That's all that is.
Fair enough, my dude. Fair enough. And you mentioned a winning weekend, a winning Super Wildcard weekend. I mean, all the props, all that stuff that I hope people by now, if you're listening to this pod, you're also following Matt on Twitter and following and reading the stuff at The Score, because that will get you some more winnings. Here on this pod, I went 3-3 on Super Wildcard Weekend. I'll take a 3-3 week. Overall, we're bringing the overall total this season to 156, 111, and 10. I will take that. It's been a long season, and at the end of the day, as you said, hey, there's just not that much time for me to screw up this season at all. So I will definitely take that. But for people that might be unfamiliar with what we do here on this pod, I will come out. I'll try to make a pick on one side or the other. And then Matt comes in with the information and education on where the line was, where it is, and where it could be going heading into game time. We just want to be able to give you a little more oomph before you make your picks heading into kickoff each and every week. And I mentioned the record only because, a lot of people will ask a lot of different things about doing your own podcast and all these things, right? Like, they'll ask about sponsorships, they'll ask about networks, they'll ask about all these different things. And without me getting too deep into that, my response often is, well, that's why we win bets. That's what the money is for. So we could talk about all these other things, which would be great, which would be cool. And I'm not mad at that.
And have been great.
And have been great.
By the way.
Of course. No. Listen, my point is overall that there's no complaints going on here, right?
No.
Because at the end of the day, that's what the money's for. That's what the good record's for. And choose wisely would be my other advice to people that I give a lot, because there's a lot of people throwing out a lot of different things online, and that's all I'll say. Choose wisely, my friends. And when I say choose wisely, that means we are starting here on our journey into the divisional round battles. We start on Saturday. The Jaguars at the Chiefs. Chiefs 8.5-point favorites. And if you follow along with us here, I have a history of coming on this pod and blindly laying the points with the Chiefs. Just blindly saying, I'm on the Chiefs. Let's go. Let's roll. But I got to say, this feels like way too many points. I think the Chiefs are a step up in weight class for the Jags, but I also think the Jags are always good for some late TDs, no matter what's going on in the game. And I'm not even talking about just last week and the epic comeback, which I'm sure we'll get into. But I just feel like the Chiefs and Trevor Lawrence, I have him in fantasy football, and the stats end up being pretty good because he's always just hucking it late. And it's like, my dude, where was this for the first three? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
The Chiefs, though, have a tendency to gear down at certain points where, they come out blazing, they come out hot, and then they kind of just chill for a minute. And they burned them last year. But at the end of the day, 8.5 points is a lot for me to lay here. And I'm going to need convincing. And it won't take a lot, but I'm going to need convincing to lay the points with the Chiefs. But I'm going to be on the Jacksonville Jaguars plus 8.5 points. I can't say that I like it, but I just feel like the responsible thing would be for me to take the points here.
Okay, that's interesting because I'm on the Chiefs here. And honestly, from a full game perspective, I agree with you a ton about the backdoor potential for the Jacksonville Jaguars, right? Like they have shown they're in for 60 minutes all season long. But if I had to say anything negative about the Jacksonville Jaguars at this point, it would be a couple of different things. One, in the recent history, right? Watching Lawrence throw interception after interception last week against the Chargers, certainly not ideal. Now you go, well, they came back and they hung in the game and he made all these plays, et cetera, et cetera. But if we're going to blame the Chargers and we're going to blame Brandon Staley and we're going to blame Joey Bosa and we're going to blame, Joe Lombardi and all the play calling and all of that sort of stuff, which we are, by the way, then you know what I mean? Like if we're shifting the pie of blame or credit here, and all of it's going to the Chargers, or a ton of it is going to the Chargers, then we can't just give a bunch of it to Trevor Lawrence as well, because my issue with him is those 4 interceptions. A lot of those were on him. Some of them were really good defensive plays, but some of them were really, really bad on his part as well. And it's not like the week before against Tennessee in what should have been a really relatively easy matchup from a pass defense standpoint. It's not like he was very good against Tennessee either. And so you've got 2 primetime home games against pretty vulnerable defenses, the Chargers from a run defense standpoint, and obviously the Titans from a pass defense standpoint. And it still kind of took, in one case, a miracle defensive play. Miracle's probably a stretch when Joshua Dobbs is dropping back to pass. But you know what I mean? Like he needed to be bailed out late by the defense in order to win that game, because I'm not sure he was going to have a game-winning drive. And then obviously the miracle comeback against the Chargers where, listen, we do an extra hour on what went wrong for LA in that game. So now you're going to go on the road and, it's Kansas City. That's a decent, theoretical home field advantage, et cetera, et cetera. And in the past, we would say, yeah, but Kansas City's defense is terrible, right? Like it was branded as all offense, virtually no defense, and Patrick Mahomes and company were so good that would just sort of mask in large part the defense's deficiencies. And that's probably why they wouldn't cover numbers like this, right? And they didn't do a ton of covering numbers like this season. They did some covering like this because the defense improved a lot. And the thing is, you have to look at the Tyreek Hill divorce, if you will. And, people go, oh, like Tyreek Hill, they're not going to be as good offensively, blah, blah, blah. They weren't trying to be as good offensively necessarily, right? They knew that he was going to get $100 million, and they didn't have that money because they were just going to live life at a certain ceiling offensively when they needed to get better defensively. They spent 2 first-round picks on the defense. Both of those guys worked out incredibly well in George Karlaftis and Trent McDuffie. And they added a couple other pieces defensively and were able to keep all the good guys around, basically, when it came to their defense. And they ended up this season finishing 6th against the pass in a yards per attempt basis this year. The Chiefs.
It's legit.
Yeah, like, wow, right? And I talked in my article this week about that game, about how when McDuffie was out, there was a 5 or 6 game stretch, and the defense was really bad in that 5-game stretch. So the idea that they were 6th this year is factoring in 6 games where their pass defense was bad. So a full strength Chiefs defense is probably something closer to 3rd, 4th, something along those lines, right? Obviously, we're sort of inventing and numbers here, but like projecting wise, like from a yards per play basis or yards per attempt basis, that would be the case. So Trevor Lawrence is going to get the sort of most difficult atmosphere, the more difficult defense than he's had in the last 2 weeks. And we're supposed to expect him to hang in in this game. Now, from a Chiefs standpoint, when you talk about like how this has, burned them in the past, et cetera, where the Chiefs sort of fall apart, and fall apart's probably a bit of a stretch, but where it sort of gets dicey for them is against the good teams, right? It's against the Bucks when they can't block the Bucks in the Super Bowl. It's against the Bengals last year, right? When again, this is that game is why they sort of changed their sort of roster configuration, right? Where they spent the different capital. But when you look at the Chiefs, who, by the way, are still, after this postseason, are still not going to have played a road playoff game in the Patrick Mahomes era, which is one of the most insane stats you're ever going to see. And who knows how long that keeps going, but it's certainly not going to end this year. When they've played their first game, sometimes that's in the divisional round, occasionally that's in the wild card, but their first game of their playoffs in the previous 4 seasons, the total score has been 90-something to 40-something in the first half of those games. They jump out to a start in these games. And so what I want to do here, before you necessarily switch your pick, because he's got the wireless mouse out, he's waving it around like the card that we're going to get him for next year. I think the bet here is the first half.
Ooh.
Because if the Jags are going to start slow, which, by the way, this season, there's a laundry list of games where they've started slowly. Think the Raiders game, right? Kudos to them for a big comeback, but you're getting down 17-0 to the Raiders. Not ideal. Cowboys, same sort of deal. I believe it was 21-7. Handful of other games. The Titans, they were down 14-7 and 10-0 in the 2 games that they played against the Titans. Like, this is a team that has gotten down big. The Lions, they just got straight up blown out against, but they were down 20-something points at halftime against the Lions. So this is a Jags team who's coming off 2 consecutive big wins, right? We talk about the jump and hug games. 2 jump and hug games. If this was in the regular season, we'd be fading the Jags, in a heartbeat. And now they're going to Andy Reid off a bye, right? Oh, there's the legendary Andy Reid off of a bye. Now, again, I don't know that necessarily means they cover 8.5, but I think that means, we talk about teams having a game script for the first 15 plays. The Chiefs might have the first 3 quarters of this game scripted out at this point. This is a team that plays Ring Around the Rosie in week 18 because apparently they have so much free time in practice that they can just burn plays or burn time working on plays like that. I don't know that we're going to see any sort of silliness out there.
How do you come up with that? Like, honestly, how do you come up with that?
Time on your hands.
And then have the audacity to like bring it up in a meeting and be like, all right, so this is what we're going to do.
But that's the thing you and I always used to talk about this, right? Like, this team, because of the continuity of Reid, Mahomes, the core on the offense, is that they have extra time where other teams are still trying to button up a lot of their sort of, smaller pieces. The Chiefs have extra time that they can just use on stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And it took a little longer for the offense to gel this season, right? Patrick Mahomes wasn't the MVP through 6 weeks, but he's the going away MVP through 18 weeks. Now, that tells me that the different pieces, right, the rookie pieces, the Watsons, the Moores, adding Kadarius Toney, and all of these other guys that they have brought in, the Juju Smith-Schusters, et cetera, right, figuring out which one of these guys should be where and how much they should play and all of that sort of thing. The running back situation. Clyde Edwards-Helaire went first in the first round of fantasy football drafts. Where's that guy at this point, right? It's like Isaiah Pacheco and Jerick McKinnon. And so, the offense has evolved throughout the season. The defense has evolved throughout the season as their rookies have gotten more comfortable. I think the Chiefs are the best team right now, certainly in the AFC. And that's from watching the Bills sort of be underwhelming, over and over and over.
Oh, yeah.
Throughout, not just the playoffs, one game, but throughout the season. So I just look at this and I go, the Chiefs are way more two-dimensional than they used to be. They have all this rest and preparation and time. And again, we've seen it time and again. And that 90-something to 40-something, the specifics are in my article. You have to just read it to get the exact number there. But 24 of those points were from that Houston game from 2019, where they literally spotted Houston 24 points in the first half, 24-0, and had the lead by halftime.
Yeah.
So take out those, don't take them out because 90 to 40 is pretty impressive in and of itself. But even, take those out, we're talking about, 90 to do some quick math here, 17 basically in the first halves of their first playoff game. So I like the first half. It's -5 in a lot of places. There's some 5.5s. I don't think that, that's going to matter all that much. I think they probably have at least a touchdown lead after the first half. And honestly, if you liked Kansas City -8.5, based on what we know about Kansas City, you're expecting them to build an early lead and then kind of hang on late. And by the way, this number, these two teams have played. It was a little while ago, but these two teams played in what I think it was week 10, something along those lines. And the number was 10, sort of toggled between 9.5 and 10. So I guess the Jaguars are getting credit for sort of obviously finishing off the season strong, finding their way into the playoffs. But the first half stuff for them has been really, really, sort of concerning here. And so I think this is the spot where Kansas City does their blowout routine. And then we go back to, worrying about Kansas City covering numbers, right? This is the, we talk about how like there's 1 or 2 games a year that implant in our head that we have to bet Kansas City every week. And it's why they cover like 33% of the time. And this is going to be that one where we go, yeah, oh man, like Kansas City, total juggernaut, blah, blah, blah. Now, I don't think they're going to be big favorites the rest of the way. So it's not going to come into play necessarily this season. Heck, they might win the Super Bowl this year and then cover, 2 out of 17 next year. I don't know. But I think this is a spot for Kansas City that I think people are getting a little too excited about Trevor Lawrence, given how we've seen him come out of the previous 2 games to start.
Yeah, for our audio listeners, the pick has been changed. The Chiefs laying 8.5 points. I will be laying the points with the Kansas City Chiefs and my guy Patty Mahomes, worth a half a billy. Yeah, it'll be an interesting game for sure to see how that plays out. And the way that you just laid everything out in terms of what we've seen from both of those teams throughout this season, but also the breakdown of the Chiefs defense. What? Patty Mahomes got a defense now?
Yeah.
It's interesting. And Spags, man, Spags is gonna be out here throwing shit at Trevor Lawrence for sure. And I think that part is also a huge, huge, huge thing to remember. And maybe, just maybe, last week I was talking about don't be afraid of the blowout. Maybe I'll just carry that over into the first pick for this week.
Yeah, and one last thing, about the defense, right, is you mentioned Spagnuolo and the idea of getting pressure on Trevor Lawrence, right? And we saw Joey Bosa have a meltdown last week and I think rightly so. As little as I want to give any credit to Joey Bosa, I think he was right. He was held on a lot of plays, and Cam Robinson, the left tackle for the Jaguars, got hurt a couple of weeks ago, and we haven't seen that kind of be an issue in a sort of mega important way for Jacksonville, in part because they were getting away with holds on Bosa. Last week. And honestly, that might have been an issue for why Lawrence was throwing interceptions too, right? Some of that pressure element and all of that sort of thing. Between Carlos Dunlap, right, another guy that they added to bolster the defense, and Karlaftis, and obviously, Frank Clark, there's some question about whether he's going to play, but obviously Chris Jones in the middle. Like, this is a legitimate defensive line as well. So, they're not going to be able to get away with false starts. Hopefully they're not going to be able to get away with holds. And you're looking at a backup left tackle here against a Chiefs defensive line that is rebuilt, healthy, and pretty darn good.
Speaking of healthy, as we move on to game 2 here of the weekend divisional round, healthy Eagles team, for the most part, we know we'll see Jalen Hurts at this point, but Eagles at home laying 7.5 points against the New York Football Giants. I know everyone's ready to ride for the Giants, but we talked about this last week, right? We talked about the Giants being able to go in and give a good go, and forget about give a good go. They won the game outright. But in terms of how those were just 2 fraudulent teams, but the Vikings were just more fraudulent. The Giants don't lose their fraudulent tag just for beating Kirk Cousins. And I shouldn't even say Kirk Cousins because I don't want to blame Kirk Cousins.
Yeah.
For beating the Vikings.
Yeah.
I love what Danny Dimes has become. Think Saquon is legit, but the Vikings have 0 defense. The Eagles do have a defense. And while I'm not really one to love to lay the 7.5, I don't really love doing that at all. I just think the line's staying at that point because there's a lot of people on the Giants bandwagon right now, and Jalen Hurts is coming back fresh. Give me the Eagles. I will lay the 7.5 points.
Okay, so the 2 reasons that you're right, one market and one non-market, are one of them that you mentioned, the non-market one, the football one, is they went from arguably the worst defense, facing the worst defense in the league in the Minnesota Vikings, to facing arguably the best, right? The Vikings, I believe, 3rd worst in yards per play allowed. The Eagles, the best team in yards per play allowed. The market reason why that you might be correct in all of this is, from a line perspective, Philadelphia, their one matchup that actually meant something, Philadelphia closed -7 on the road against the Giants, and they won that game by 26 points. So, we do the flip the home field advantage thing, right? And let's say 2 points for either side here, because I think both teams have that sort of, 2-point home field advantage. You're talking about a line that probably should be Eagles minus 11. Okay. So you go, okay, that's okay. I'm getting line value. I'm getting, like you said, people getting excited about the Giants because of last week and a massive sort of change in not just opponent, but environment as well, right? Going from indoors against a bad defense to outdoors against a good defense is kind of a really rough combination if you think about that. The reason why 7.5 is inviting and why the line was never going to be 11. Let's just be honest about that, right? Like it could be 9.5, and hell, it might end up being 9.5 by the time game time rolls around. And my number was around 9, if from a rating standpoint. But the reason that adjustment has happened is this isn't a situation where I'll use the Jags as an example here, I guess, but there's some other sort of better examples. This isn't a situation where a team has kind of gotten here via smoke and mirrors in order to raise their rating. Like the Jags raised their rating by winning games, but they also raised their rating by kind of doing so in unsustainable fashion in a lot of cases. Whereas the Giants, as the best team against the spread this season, have consistently outperformed the market. So the rating for that game, even as they lost that game by 26 points against Philadelphia the first time around, was probably too low then because it was probably too low all season long. I'd love to go back to before the season started and tell you like, hey, let's just bet the Giants every game because I think they're going to be better than most think. And we would have ended up finishing 12-4-1, something along those lines. But, we didn't. Nobody did. Right. And so the thing is like, the Giants rating keeps getting boosted, but it's for a reason. It keeps getting boosted because they keep covering because it was never correct in the first place. I think about it's a weird sort of thing to think about. I don't know if you remember the Giants' visit to the Jags this year. And remember they were like 7-2 or something like that. And the Jags were favored by 3 points. And the Jags were like 2-6 or 2-7 or something. And everybody's like, how can the Jags be, 3-point favorites in this game? Well, the Jags are now a playoff team. And now it sort of feels like if they played tomorrow, the Jags would probably be about 3-point favorites, right? But you probably like the Giants in that game in the same way that people like the Giants in that week, 6, 7, 8 game, whatever that was. So the point is like if they keep covering these games, these numbers were never correct in the first place. So I can see why in this situation that they would be just quote unquote 7.5-point favorites. Now, if you go back to that first game, Saquon Barkley only played 20 snaps. And there were some really weird plays. There was a 4th and 7 by the Eagles. That was an easy knockdown pass defense play where Julian Love, the safety for the Giants, just blew right by the ball and just missed it. And the Eagles scored like a 41, 43-yard touchdown on that play. They went up 14-0 there. The Giants got the ball back. They punted. The punter botched. The snap was all botched. And the Eagles got a 30-yard, one-play touchdown drive to make it 21-0, basically in the first quarter, or at least early in the second quarter, 3 drives in. Not a spot where the Giants want to be, right? The Giants do not want to be down 21-0. And it kind of got there in a weird way because if Love just knocks that ball down, the Giants are down 7-0 with the ball at their own 43-yard line. That's a pretty decent spot for the rest of that to see how the rest of that game went. Now, again, without a healthy sort of, I think he was sick or something that week, Saquon Barkley, where he only plays 20 snaps, the Giants were always going to be in trouble in that game. So I think the Eagles scoring 48 points in that game is sort of really sort of a cosmetic number. I don't think they're going to score anywhere near that in this game. But the problem is I'm not sure the Giants are going to be able to score against this Eagles defense either. You add into the mix a Jalen Hurts, back from the shoulder. They played their full complement of guys in that Week 18 game. So while that Week 18 game, you throw that out because you had, random quarterback, random running back, random wide receivers for the Giants. So from an Giants offense, Philly defense standpoint, that didn't really mean anything to me. But it kind of meant something to me that the Eagles had trouble against a lot of backups, by the way, on the Giants defense. And so if I had to bet this game, I think I'm taking the Giants plus 7.5 because I rather be on the side of the underdog who's been kind of going above and beyond all season. And that hasn't been the case for the Jags, but it has been the case for the Giants. But what I'm more interested in is this total. And I know that's a little bit scary. Everybody hears me say totals and they should run for the hills. 48 and a half for two teams that I'm not so sure are going to be able to move the ball as well as people think. Because a lot of the Eagles' scoring this year has been on big plays. Let's throw it deep to A.J. Brown. Let's pick on a cornerback on the other team that, maybe a starting cornerback is out. We can pick on that guy. Or Jalen Hurts running around and Miles Sanders running around. Another name to mention, Leonard Williams didn't play in that Week 14 game. Obviously didn't play in the Week 18 game because nobody played in the Week 18 game of any significance for the Giants. But that's a pretty big body in the middle. Mm-hmm. And the Eagles had 250 yards rushing in Week 14.
Yeah.
I like their chances a lot better at stopping the run when Leonard Williams is in there. When Jalen Hurts might not be so apt to take off. They might save him for short yardage plays. Are they going to do the fourth down, 4th and 1, everybody pile into Jalen Hurts quarterback sneak with a guy who has a shoulder injury an injury to his throwing shoulder? I think there's some advantages there that the Eagles had in the first game that they're not going to have in this game. But I think overall it leads itself to something closer to like a 21-14, 24-17 type of game. And I think the market is looking for something like 28-20. Even 28-20 would stay under 48 and a half. I kind of feel like 28 seems high for the Eagles and 20 even feels high for the Giants. So with both teams sort of, that projection feeling higher than I think it should be, I have to take the under here at 48 and a half.
Okay. A little extra juice here for the listeners with something added. Bonus here, we'll call it, with the little over under here. We'll keep things moving though with the Bengals at the Buffalo Bills. Bengals are 5.5 point dogs in Buffalo. 5.5 points. What does that sound like to you? That sounds like it's primed in the Vegas zone. I would normally love to just blindly hop on the Bengals, right? But I will say that the thing that has me worried is their O-line, an O-line that they, tried from the beginning of the season to just build up and have a brand new O-line to protect Joe Burrow. And we've seen that O-line just get beaten up in terms of injuries. And now we're here in the playoffs and we're worried about, can this O-line survive? Do they have enough health to make it through? On the flip side, Buffalo Bills. The Bills looked shaky last week. Josh Allen looked shaky last week. I mean, is that the wake-up call, the scare from Skylar Thompson and company that the Bills need to kind of wake up and remember that everyone was running away telling us that they are the favorites to win the Super Bowl? Because that did not look like that team last week against the Dolphins team and their third-string quarterback. I just can't lay either way. I can't lay 5.5 points with that Buffalo Bills team. And I know that it's a different week, it's a different game, and all that fun stuff. But I can't lay 5.5 points against Joe Burrow in the playoffs. I'm just not going to be there laying 5.5 points against Joe Burrow. Give me the plus 5.5. I just Joe Burrow and what he's been able to show us, what he can do. Even last year in the playoffs without an O-line, and he led the team to the Super Bowl. And now you're telling me at least he has fragments of an O-line, and there's a chance that their guys might play. And I'm getting 5.5 points against that Buffalo Bills team and Josh Allen, who is what's the number? Is it at 30 interceptions and fumbles combined this season? It's something like that, right? Like it's an possible, insane number. But either way, turnovers in the playoffs. It didn't burn you against Skylar Thompson, but it will burn you against Joe Burrow. I will be taking plus 5.5 points with the Cincinnati Bengals. Sorry for rambling, but I'm just hype right now with my guy.
No, that's great because you hit all the important points, right? Because we were talking about offensive line injuries when it was, just the right tackle going into the first time these two teams are supposed to meet, right? Three weeks ago, right? Into obviously week 17, Monday Night Football. And so I think that's where we have to start here with the point spread, because a lot of people will look at this and be like, that's too many points. That's a lot of points, blah, 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 right? And I think that's the important thing to start with, because you have to remember that Monday Night Football game. Now, we don't know what happened. And again, thank God, Hamlin's okay, but it would have been really cool to see what would have happened in that game, because that was, again, we talk about how sort of weird it was that thing, that medical situation could have happened to anybody, feels like, could have happened at any time and in any game. And it just happened to happen in this game that was kind of, the centerpiece of the entire regular season from a playoff seeding standpoint, and was almost definitely, it got a little dicey there for honestly both teams last week, but was almost definitely going to be a matchup in the playoffs. Because we didn't get to see what happened, we don't get to change our ratings too drastically off of a game that closed 2.5 for the Bills on the road against the Bengals. So when this game this week opened 3.5 at home for the Bills, you can see how bettors, Sean's with a lot of money, saw that and were like, a 1-point change for location from Cincinnati to Buffalo? No. And this has to be at least 3, maybe, we just gave a theoretical 4-point flip for Philadelphia and New York. It's got to be a 4-point flip for this game. And a 4-point flip from 2.5 gets you to 6.5. Now, the reason this isn't 6.5 is because of the respect of Joe Burrow and the fact that when bettors go in on it at -3.5, and then it gets to and touches 6, they're immediately going to bet back the other way and try to catch a middle, because 6 is a key number, right? You at least push, or theoretically at least push, once you get to overtime. Now, obviously, playoff rules are different, and things get mega weird in the playoffs, and we got 2-point conversions in play all of a sudden. So everybody be careful out there on that. Not that you can sort of plan for that, unfortunately. But that's why this number is never going to get to sort of 6.5. And if it does, I think it's really telling. Honestly, I think it's really telling that it got from -3.5 to -5.5 so quickly. Now, I froze in this game. I didn't hit it at -3.5. I was like, well, maybe because people love the Bengals so much, somebody's going to jump in at +3.5 and we'll be able to get a -3. Maybe a different book that opened a little bit slower would start at -3 or something along those lines. So I missed it. So the problem is I have a real issue with betting a line that I am not getting the value on. Value was 3.5 with the Bills. Value is no longer 5.5 with the Bills. But it's not with the Bengals either. So this line is getting, is pretty appropriate, right? I think 6 is probably the fair number. So I guess in theory, there's maybe a tiny bit of value left with the Bills. So I have to come up with a bet for this game. Now, I haven't written my a preview article, for this game. It's Thursday morning as we speak. And so I've only gotten through Saturday's games. So I'm sitting here on like, what side am I going to go on? Because I don't want to be the guy who waits and sees it and gets this at 6 and bets the Bengals at 6 and is feeling pretty good about like, okay, I got the best of the number with the Bengals, and then watches the Bills win by 14 points because the Bengals can't move the ball on offense, which, by the way, they didn't really move the ball all that well last week against the Ravens, right? Like, we don't have to get into sort of what a fluky win that is, but I'm sorry if there's a fumble on a quarterback sneak at the 1-yard line that immediately goes 98 yards the other way because the ball landed in the hands of sort of the last man, or the guy, the guy who was sort of closest to the end zone, if you will, 98 yards away. I just kind of have a problem thinking that the Bengals, when we know that the offensive line is compromised, we know that they hadn't been able to run the football really all season long by and large anyway. I just don't know where the scoring is going to come from the Bengals. But the problem is, and the reason I hopped in live against the Dolphins, or on the Dolphins last week, is because I don't have all that much respect for the Bills defense right now. And so I've been sitting here waiting for an opportunity to fade the Bills because of their defense. And it took me one drive, ironically, a touchdown drive for the Bills, for me to hop in at plus 17.5 on the Dolphins last week, because I'm like, yeah, just give me enough points here, because I think that the Bills are capable of honestly being underwhelming, which we've seen all season long, like you mentioned. Right? And that's why your points are so valid, right? Because I don't really want to lay this many points with the Bills either. So I'm sitting here going like, is there a team total, something along those lines? So I'm going to do a little more research later today into a team total and that kind of thing. So I can't talk you out of the Bengals necessarily, but I think it's just be forewarned. And I'm not referencing you by any stretch of the imagination. We're going to get to the next game and why I think you're on top of this, beyond the fact that you're hitting 66% or 63% of your picks this season or whatever it is. I just, every person who I don't think really understands how this works has been on the Bengals in media because they think it's too many points. And it just needs to be mentioned that it's not too many points. It's probably a fair number now that's been appropriately bet into place because it's the NFL playoffs.
Yeah.
And the line gets bet into place pretty quick. And if you're not on top of any sort of mistake, and Bills minus 3.5 was a mistake. And if you're not on top of that, like on Sunday night at like midnight when this stuff like opens up, you're going to miss out on the best of the number. So fundamentally, that's the lesson in all of this, which doesn't really help anybody necessarily just yet when it comes to bets on this game. But don't worry, we'll have a bet on this game. We will have props on this game. You're just going to have to wait to read about it over at the Score.
I think too, for me, I think one of the things is I can see the Bengals winning this game. Right. So of course I'm going to take the 5.5 points. And that's one of the things where like, I understand those are two different things in two different conversations. And I totally understand that side of it. Right.
I'll say this. And I think I think a bet on the Bengals on the point spread or just period is a bet on the idea that Burrow overcomes the pass protection and offensive line issues, of which there honestly almost has to be some.
Yeah.
And if he does, then yeah, plus 200, plus 2 something. I don't have it in front of me on the money line. I think honestly becomes the better bet. Because it's kind of unlike any other game in this. It kind of becomes a yes or no, really very specific yes or no issue. And is the Bengals offensive line a catastrophe? And if the answer is no, then the Bengals money line is actually, probably a better bet. If the answer is yes, then it's going to be hard for the Bengals to keep this game close anyway, because I don't really think the defense is going to do all that much, right? They got outgained. And that's the thing. Like fundamentally, if this is week 18, honestly, if this is week 14, I certainly would like the Bengals plus 5.5 or 6 points, but too much stuff has happened with regards to those injuries that make me sort of want to bet on the Bengals. But everybody knows those things, and it's why the number is as high as it is, right? It's just, is it going to be a catastrophe? If it is, it's probably Bills by 2 touchdowns. And if it's not, then you're probably right down to the final drive. And when it comes to money lines or anytime touchdowns, it's not about whether they win or they lose. And that's hopefully what we've sort of understood from the round robin money line parlay. And listen, it's a weird lesson when all of them actually score last week, or almost all of them actually score last week from a touchdown standpoint. But when you're watching the game, do you feel good about the bet that you've made, even if it hasn't necessarily won, right? I bet Matt Breida to score a touchdown last week. Matt Breida had 21 snaps. He was plus 500 to score a touchdown. And he was the focal point of a trick play that the Giants and Daniel Jones ran near the end zone, where they tried their like fake to Barkley Statue of Liberty behind the back play. That's all I can ask from a plus 500, right?
Totally.
And in a plus 2 something money line for the Bengals, if all you're asking theoretically is, can this offensive line hold up? Can the offensive scheme and Joe Burrow make up for the offensive line deficiencies? If you're watching the game and the answer is yes halfway through the game, you're going to feel pretty good about that money line bet, even if it doesn't necessarily win.
I like it. I like it a lot. You know what I also like, though? My San Francisco 49ers closing out the weekend. Niners, 4-point favorites at home to the Dallas Cowboys. Brock Purdy, showing that he will. I doubt this, and I shouldn't be like this confident in saying this, but I don't think he'll be the reason that the San Francisco 49ers don't continue on in the playoffs. This is a step up in weight class. Obviously, the Cowboys defense is a lot better than the Seahawks defense. I understand all that, but the positions that Kyle Shanahan is putting him in, I just think Brock Purdy is showing us that he is capable of just not bleeping this up with all the skill players that he has around him. Just don't mess this up. And he's doing a good job. And I almost feel like that's a slap in the face, because he's doing a little bit more. I feel like Jimmy Garoppolo was like, quote unquote, just don't mess this up. Where Brock Purdy, there's a little more to his game than that. But either way, Niners, the thing that worries me a little bit as I see this line at 4 points is the Niners schedule. Like I've been saying this for the whole year, they haven't really played anyone, which isn't their fault, but they've also dummied the teams that have been in front of them, right? So like a lot of times when we look at schedule and we talk about schedules being weak, cool, but they gave those teams the business. The one weakness with the Niners, secondary. The Cowboys have the weapons to take advantage of that, to exploit that.
Right.
But I trust that Niners D-line, baby, to get home. And much like Josh Allen being shaky with all the turnovers, when you look at the top of that list of quarterback turnovers, who's right beside him? Your friend and mine, your man's Dakota. Give me the Niners, right? Give me the Niners. I will lay the points because I'm trusting in DeMeco Ryans, scheming up, confusing Dak, and having him return to the turnover machine we've all come to love. Niners laying the 4 points at home. Let's roll.
So I alluded to it before. There's a lot to talk about this game, but I alluded to it before where, you sent me a text. We were talking via text earlier this week, and just that kind of out of nowhere, and admit, not out of nowhere, they're, the 49ers are your favorite team. So like they would be top of mind, but at 4 points, you were like, am I crazy or is this line too high? He's switching hats. He's going to the Niners hat. You're like, am I crazy or is this line too high? And I wrote back, it's like, yeah, it's kind of high. And then we saw it move like within hours to 3.5. And so you have it up at 4. And I think there's some places, I suppose, that still have it at 4, but it's pretty much 3.5 now, which is an indication that like, maybe it's just because it's your team, or maybe I'm rubbing off on you, or maybe you just know what you're doing in the first place. But like, you're on to stuff when it comes to like, is this line a little bit too high? But I see that you're on your 49ers anyway, so that's not necessarily stopping you from laying it with San Francisco. I kind of thought you were going to be on the Cowboys plus 4. Now, I look at it and I go, okay, man, like I have this market rating at like 2. But part of that is because the Cowboys have gotten so much credit in the marketplace, and their rating was pretty similar to the 49ers for basically the last half of the season. Now, you had some 49ers wobble because of, some uncertainty about Brock Purdy. And that's where you make the good point about the opponent. And the thing that we do in the media is like, we're so lazy, right? Like Brock Purdy, never heard of him, even though I played 4 years in college. But Brock Purdy, never heard of him, has to be terrible because he's the third stringer. Like, as if any of these coaches, have never made any mistakes in player evaluation. And by the way, what was the other option, right? Like Trey Lance is obviously going to be the starter given what they invested there. Jimmy G was always going to have to be, sort of a backup plan there, because even though we might think Brock Purdy's pretty good, like you still can't rely on a 6th or 7th round pick or whatever, right? So yeah, of course he was always going to be the third string quarterback. But we get so lazy and we go, well, there's got to be a Brock Purdy like blow up game. He's got to crash down to earth here some point. He can't keep doing this. But when the opponent is Seattle twice, and Washington, and Arizona, and and so on and so, and the Raiders, right? Like, no, he doesn't have to blow up. He doesn't have to screw things up. Here's the thing: we're getting into like serious time here. The Cowboys, big boy time. The Cowboys are a team. The Eagles, theoretically, next week are a team. Whomever they face in the Super Bowl, which right now, if I had to guess, was going to be either Kansas City, Buffalo, or Cincinnati. And if it's Cincinnati, they made it through a pretty good gauntlet with that offensive line issue. And if it's those other teams, like I don't think San Francisco is going to be favored in those games. But who knows? Because all of a sudden, San Francisco's rating has shot through the Cowboys, right? Has gone past, not just sort of dead even with the Cowboys, but has gotten through. And so I look at this number at 4 and I go, okay, well, we had the 49ers at like 66, 68, kind of all season long. And now they're up to like a 74, 75, like literally rated next to Kansas City and Buffalo as a top team in the league. Now we can sit here and be like, yeah, no, that totally makes sense. But like you mentioned, it's built off of these dominations of these teams. And so I can't necessarily disagree with it, because when I go back and I sort of go, okay, if this number's 4, we use previous point spreads to determine what this week's point spread is going to be. But how about let's take this week's point spread and determine what the previous week's point spreads are supposed to be. So if we do that and we go back to last week, and that number was what, 9, I think it pretty much stuck around 9 last week against Seattle. Yeah. Well, with this point spread, that number should have been 11. You go, okay, though. They won that game. They covered 11. Like, hard to argue. What about week 18? Well, number should have been 15 against Arizona. They covered that too. Okay, so maybe, they would have been able to get away with 15. Previous week, Las Vegas. Number was 10. That was the spread. So yeah, they didn't cover it, but like that was the number.
The number was accurate.
That number was accurate. Now it had more to do with the Raiders being downgraded that week, but that was still the closing line in that game. Let's go one more. Washington. That number was 7. With this point spread, that would suggest that the number should have been 9. Hard to argue. 49, you know what I mean? So they keep covering the new rating, new rating, same as the old rating, right? They kept covering these numbers. Same thing, San Francisco and Seattle on the road. This number would be 7.5. They just barely covered that number, right? I think that game was 9-8, something along those lines, right? So like, if you had used the rating that they're at now in those previous games, they would have covered all those numbers anyway. So it's not like this rating now has them overrated. So that's where I'm kind of stuck here. Now, the problem is because the matchup is so different, that's where I go, if Purdy turned the ball over 3 times because Micah Parsons was out there causing a disturbance and he wasn't able to scramble. And by the way, if I at home know exactly what Brock Purdy is going to do when he scrambles towards towards out of bounds, stops 1 yard short of out of bounds, and then just kind of throws one, maybe at somebody, maybe not at somebody, the Cowboys probably know that too, right? So like, this is where you get the idea of tape on a guy. He wants to scramble left. He wants to scramble right instead of scrambling forward. You don't see a lot of scrambling for yardage for Purdy. You see a lot of scrambling sideways. So if I know that, the Cowboys probably know that. And they have sideline to sideline speed on defense. Not just Parsons, but some of those other guys as well. And so I just look at this and I go, and part of this is, and listen, I'm on the 49ers as a concept. I have 49ers plus 550 to win the NFC from like way early on in the season, a number that is long gone and has been long gone for a long time. I want the 49ers to win this game. And maybe it's because we're now at a point where I think the 49ers theoretically could lose the game. I start getting a little worried about that sort of thing. But I think the point is I think both teams are going to be able to score on the other team's defense. And I think the other team's defense is capable of turning over the other team. And so it's not just going to be Dak theoretically that could have some turnovers here. I think it could be Purdy as well. And while both teams' defense is theoretically good, part of what makes them good is that they turn the other team over. So I think that, again, differ from the point spread here, because I think the point spread has sort of been worked into place correctly, even though it sort of looked like it was a little too big. And if I had to, I would probably take the Cowboys. I think there's going to be scoring in this game. I think the Cowboys can score on the 49ers, and maybe that means that Dak Prescott throws a pick 6 and we get 7 points going the other way. I think that the Cowboys, given the fact that Seattle was able to move the ball and that the Cowboys have a wide receiver who can match up against Charvarius Ward, who had absolutely nothing for DK Metcalf in that game. Imagine if they had, not a ton of guys have anything for DK Metcalf per se, but imagine like that the Seahawks didn't have DK Metcalf to throw over and over and over and over on Charvarius Ward. The 49ers would win that game by 50 points. Whether it's CD Lamb or Michael Gallup or hell, T.Y. Hilton occasionally, right? Like there's enough kind of weapons there that I think the Cowboys move the ball as well. So I think there's going to be back and forth. I think there's going to be some turnovers in this game. And the total for this game is lower than the Eagles-Giants game, which I don't really sort of see. Like we talked about a 28-20 game as being kind of the max for that Giants-Eagles game. Isn't 28-20 kind of like the starting point for Cowboys 49ers, or 24-24 if you want to sort of say it that way? I just think these two offenses are too good that like there's just kind of can't go under here. I mean, obviously it can go under, and listen, it's me in a total, so it probably will go under. But I think the number here, 46.5, I think that's an over in this game. And I'm always, sort of trepidatious when it comes to totals because we get such bad luck. I mean, listen, I had the under in Jags Chargers last week. And if Trevor Lawrence, think about it at home, right? If Trevor Lawrence doesn't throw 4 interceptions in the first half, what's the score at halftime? It's probably like 10-3. Like neither team was moving the ball on offense. So like, yeah, we've suffered some bad beats and some unfortunate circumstances. I think whether either quarterback turns the ball over or not, I think this is a high scoring game. I think this is that dramatic game that comes down to the late field goal. If it's a Cowboys field goal, it's going to be wildly interesting to see who or if Brett Maher can actually make that kick.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's hard for me to lay the 49ers here, but I already am invested in the 49ers, so I kind of don't have to make a point spread bet.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, to me, it's Cowboys or nothing because I think this game is just going to be that type of game. But I
Mhm.
also think it's going to be a high scoring game.
Yeah, it'll be a great game for sure. And two like classic NFL teams. Like this goes back to my childhood. Niners, Cowboys in the
Absolutely.
playoffs. I love everything about this. Cannot wait until this game on Sunday. But before we get to that game, there's so much more time for things and angles and thoughts and bets and picks to be made. Where can the people find you to get more of the information that you so crave to give out to the masses, my friend?
Yeah, at MRussAuthentic on Twitter. Obviously, we're living and dying with various things, especially in the playoffs, and then we'll eventually get to, March Madness and that sort of thing, right? As we say, celebrating and commiserating. So celebrating. Let's see if I can remember the four guys: Elijah Mitchell, Evan Ingram last week, Isaiah Hodgins. That was probably my favorite one. I'm missing one. Oh, our boy Dawson Knox, who always comes through with us. Celebrating all of those for commiserating over not getting a touchdown with Chris Godwin. I will say, we make, I think end up being something close to, obviously you have to kind of mess around with the math here from an odds perspective, but I think that ended up cashing about 18-1, the round robin touchdown parlay. So a lot of people have a little extra money that they're playing with. And I think it's worth kind of mentioning here before we go, sort of some bankroll management concepts here, right? And the idea is, over a long term, right, to slowly build your bankroll. The idea is, okay, on point spread or minus 110 betting things, props, sides, totals, whatever, let's get on a 55-56% clip. And every 100 bets, we're going to end up making, 5.5 units, maybe 6 units for every 100 bets that we make. And then over the course of the year, right, we're growing the bankroll. When you have kind of a big hit like we did last week, there's a tendency to trick yourself into thinking that you're a better bettor than you are. Like you might just be clipping along at 50-51% and then just caught a nice win on kind of a thing that isn't really sustainable. And the whole point of whether it's the anytime touchdown round robin parlay or the money line parlay is that it's supposed to be one bet out of the course of, on a wild card weekend. We got 2 props per game and a side or a total in the game, right? You're probably going to have 10-15 bets over the course of that weekend. So one bet, winning or losing, isn't going to make that big of a difference, but it's a bet that could win you, like you said, 18 units, could win you 60 units if we get a Godwin touchdown. Mm-hmm. So the point is, don't start getting loose because you hit one big bet thinking that you had built your bankroll on an accumulation. Save that, that accumulation concept, and maybe just take that money out. Like if you hit that one big bet, maybe you're a $10 bettor and you hit the big bet for 18-1, you've got an extra $180 in your account. Maybe just take that out. And if you can, I definitely did. And if you can manage it responsibly and stick to your units and all of that sort of thing, yeah, that extra 180 is going to act like 18 extra bets. Right? 18 extra $10 bets or whatever. I'm obviously using that as an example, but don't trick yourself into thinking that all of a sudden you need to now be betting $20 a game, $30 a game, if you've been betting $10 a game up until that point. Right. And so obviously everything is different from everybody else, but just don't lose your head out there because we got, frankly, a little bit lucky. Now, all of these bets are good bets. And so, somebody wrote to me this week. He's like, how are you going to follow up last weekend? I just said to him, the same thing we do every weekend, right? The same thing we try to do every night, Pinky, try to take over the world. We're going to just make good bets. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they're going to work out and sometimes they're not. And sometimes they're going to be Matt Breida getting a goal line carry on a trick play and not working. And sometimes they're going to be Dawson Knox, catching a ball and somehow getting his knee in bounds before he goes out of bounds. And he almost scored another touchdown, but he, quote unquote, dropped the ball on review, right? So who knows, man? All of this stuff is coin flippy type stuff. So be responsible about it. Don't increase your betting units. Increase your betting units after a year when you have been clicking along and tracking your bets and you've been clicking along at 55-56% and you have shown long-term profitability. Don't increase your bets just because we caught a nice winner on wild card weekend.
Yeah. And I feel like people got to realize to do what works for you best. Right. And so for me, the funny thing was that hit, we talked about that, what hit there and the 4 teams and cashing out early and all that fun stuff. But that was in the middle of a bunch of other just random bets that were made over the weekend. And I was like, you know what? I don't know if I should have really been playing around with this Lakers -5.5 in-game bet that I made with 3 minutes left against the Rockets. And now I'm rooting for Russell Westbrook to hit free throws down the stretch.
Right.
I'm going to consider myself lucky here
Yeah.
that heat check went in
Right.
and cash out some of this money here
Yeah.
before you get a little too loose. And it's
Yeah.
it's just such great advice in terms of understanding yourself, understanding that like a lot of it is coin flipping, but also at the same time, when you hit, just understand that that's just a hit. It's
Yeah.
just one, you
Yeah.
know, and understand you're gonna have the bad beat going the other way, right? So
Well, I tweeted the other like on that Knox touchdown that was reversed. I'm like, if he hadn't had the first touchdown, like how annoying would that reversal have been? Like I was like,
Oh,
I don't
yeah.
care if he caught this ball or not, right? 21-0, 17-0 doesn't really make a difference. Honestly, it made a difference to me because I had Dolphins plus 17.5 at that point. But as far as the Dawson,
but that's further to the point, right?
But yeah, honestly, but it's like imagine if he had been out of bounds on the first one and then it dropped the second one. Like that's how close it is to not, being able to kind of cash that out. So just understand that, like, is it you? Is it the guy that you followed? Is it just us getting lucky together? And like, let's just be responsible about it. And so when you can withdraw some money that, isn't insignificant, again, depends obviously on your unit size and all that sort of thing. But that's why I say, like, consider it 18 bets. Now, if those 18 bets can stay in your account and you can treat them like 18 bets, that's great. But if you're going to treat those 18 bets like 9 bets or like 4 bets, like that's not really being responsible with your money.
That's what I'm saying. Putting it on the Lakers -5.5 with 3 minutes left against the Rockets. No, but I say all that. I'm like half joking, obviously, but the reality is know your numbers, know what you're comfortable with, play within your limits, all that other fun stuff that people just say. And it's just trivial thrown out there randomly. But like the actual fact of the matter is understand your numbers. Most important lesson that I've got from doing this with your friend and mine, Mr. Matt Russell. So make sure that you follow along as well at MRussAuthentic and everything he writes at The Score, because that will give you even more information and education that we all crave here to make our bets better week in and week out. And for me, my name is Sheldon Alexander. You can find me on Twitter at Shell Alexander, on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander. And as I always say, I used to pray for times like this to rhyme like this. This is the On Blast Podcast, NFL Picks Edition, part of the On Blast Podcast Network. As always, unpolished and unapologetic. Until next time, see ya.